What if I told you some spirits never left their graves, and tonight they might be watching you? If you love ghost stories, hit subscribe, tap like, and share this video so we can bring you even more terrifying tales. Subscribe, like, share to keep the ghosts coming. The night sky of 1953 was not the polished, parted, charted airspace we imagine today, with satellites circling endlessly and radar maps glowing across control towers. It was an expanse of velvet darkness where radio voices often faded into static and engines hummed like lonely prayers suspended over an indifferent sea. Air travel was a mixture of courage, routine, and superstition, and though war had passed into an easy peace, the machines that flew were still half ghosts of combat, repurposed for families and commerce, for men and women eager to cross distances once thought impossible. The Avro York was such a machine, and on that cold February night, one of them lifted from the ground in Malta, carrying souls who had no reason to suspect they were boarding not just a flight but a story that would never land. It is tempting, from the safety of hindsight, to see the flight as doomed from the start, but at Lucca Airport it looked ordinary, almost mundane. Engines roared, luggage was loaded, papers checked, children yawned in their seats, their mothers smoothing hair and coats, their fathers checking watches and speaking in clipped tones. The crew, efficient and experienced, moved with the weary confidence of men who had done this many times before. The York itself was no stranger to the Mediterranean sky. Its wings had cut through storms, its tires had kissed runways in Cairo, Tripoli. It had carried soldiers, mail, even dignitaries. This night was nothing unusual, a simple charter, Malta to England with a stop in Cyprus, routine and unremarkable. Yet the most haunting stories are born not from the less extraordinary, but from the ordinary that suddenly ruptures. The York, registered as GAHFA, became such a rupture. It is not remembered for crashing with fiery spectacle or for heroic last messages that would echo in newspapers. It is remembered because it vanished so completely that even the sea, which usually returns fragments of tragedy, an oil slick, a wing, a body, remained silent. To disappear without a trace is to become more than lost. It is to become myth. The night was clear enough when the aircraft lifted. Witnesses described the engines as steady, the climb smooth. Families at Lucca waved their final goodbyes. A few lights blinked on the runway, then receded into darkness as the York pressed eastward toward Cyprus. For hours it flew, and for hours the world still believed in its presence. The radio calls were routine, a voice speaking calmly to controllers. Coordinates confirmed, all according to plan. Then came silence. At first, silence in aviation is not unusual. Radios fail, frequencies shift, interference rises from storm or static. Controllers wait, repeat their calls, adjust their dials. But when silence stretches too long, it thickens into something else. Concern sharpens into dread. The York's position should have been logged. Its approach should have been expected. But the expected never came. The York's voice never returned. Its shadow never appeared on Cyprus radar. It had lifted from Malta, yes, but somewhere between here and there, the sky consumed it. Search parties mobilized. British, Cypriot, and Maltese forces scanned the waters. Aircraft traced wide arcs over the sea, searching for any glimmer of wreckage, any floating sign of catastrophe. Ships scoured the waves, peering into the troughs and ridges of the Mediterranean. But the sea, which often betrays its secrets reluctantly, gave up nothing. Not a scrap of metal, not a life jacket, not an oil slick. It was as though the York had not crashed, but had been erased. The families of the missing clung to the edges of hope. Perhaps it had landed somewhere remote. Perhaps the radios had failed. Perhaps they were alive on an island or a strip of coast, yet uncontacted. In the first days, hope stuttered and flickered. But as days turned into weeks, hope twisted into unease, then into horror. No answers came. No survivors returned. The York remained suspended in silence. It is here that the ghost story truly begins. Not in the mechanical failure or meteorological event that might explain a disappearance, but in the void that followed. For voids are never empty. Human imagination rushes to fill them. The missing are not simply gone, they become shadows at the edge of dreams. Voices heard faintly in the static of radios. Lights flickering where no aircraft should be. The York did not die in spectacle. It dissolved into legend. To understand why this particular disappearance lingers in haunted memory, one must place it in the lineage of ghost flights. The early 20th century was already marked by tales of aircraft that vanished. In 1947, the Stardust disappeared over the Andes, leaving behind only a final, cryptic radio message, Stendic, that has never been explained. In 1945, Flight 19, a group of 5 US Navy bombers, disappeared in the Bermuda Triangle, fueling a mythology of skies that swallow without reason. The York of 1953 joined these ranks, but with a crueler silence, no last words, no fragments of fuselage, no closure. It was as if the aircraft had obeyed some secret summons, departing not for England, but for another realm entirely. The Mediterranean too has its reputation. It is not just a sea of leisure and sunlight, but a cradle of myths where gods once walked, where monsters swam beneath waves, where storms were sent as punishment by unseen hands. Every coastline is littered with ruins of ships swallowed without warning. Every culture around it whispers tales of curses and spirits that dwell in the waters. To vanish here is not simply to vanish, it is to be taken, and so it is easy to imagine that the York's final flight crossed an unseen threshold, that its compass needle spun uselessly as the world it knew receded. For the loved ones left behind, the lack of wreckage was worse than death. Death has ritual, mourning, a finality. Absence has none. Absence lingers like a phantom, returning in dreams and in quiet moments, whispering, perhaps they are not dead, perhaps they are trapped somewhere, waiting. Mothers would wake in the night, certain they had heard a child's voice. Wives would glance at doorways, expecting the silhouette of their husbands. Even years later, a knock at the door could ignite a rush of impossible hope before disappointment descended again. This is how the dead become ghosts, not only in the skies but in the hearts of the living. The York's story became a hushed tale in aviation circles. Pilots spoke of it in low tones, as though afraid that speaking too loudly might invite a similar fate. They told of ghost planes seen over the Mediterranean lights that appeared on clear nights, moving steadily before vanishing without trace. Some claimed radar would occasionally catch a fleeting signal where no aircraft should be, a blip that came and went like a phantom heartbeat. Fishermen whispered of hearing engines overhead in empty skies, a droning vibration that sent shivers through the water, though nothing passed above dot, and so the stage was set. The York was no longer merely a missing aircraft. It had become something else, something neither alive nor dead, a ghost plane, condemned to circle the skies of 1953 forever, its passengers trapped in a twilight state, unaware that decades had passed, unaware that the world below had moved on. In this introduction, the facts of the disappearance blur with the growing mythology that clung to it. To tell this story is to open a door not only into history but into the uneasy space between history and legend, between reality and haunting. For if the York truly vanished, then the question is not simply where it went, but what it became. And it is this question that will lead us deeper into the haunting, into the realm of shadows, where the silence of the Mediterranean night is filled, not with answers, but with whispers. The silence that followed the disappearance of the Skyways Avro York was not the silence of still water, but the silence of something hidden, something withheld, as if the Mediterranean had drawn a curtain across its surface and refused to let the living see what it had taken. For months after, the newspapers moved on, the headlines dulled, and official records closed the file with words that said nothing. Presumed lost, cause unknown. But the living do not forget so easily, especially when the dead refuse to stay buried. And it was in the wake of this silence that stories began to emerge, not from the mouths of officials, but from those who lived on the edges of the sky and sea, those who sensed the strange in the ordinary, and who knew that when a thing vanishes too completely, it does not vanish at all. It began with the fishermen, off the coasts of Cyprus and Malta. Men accustomed to reading the moods of the sea reported sounds in the night that did not belong. They spoke of a droning hum that carried across still waters, the unmistakable vibration of propellers cutting the air, rising and fading, circling as if searching. They would look up at the sky, clear and star-swept, and see nothing. No wing lights, no shadow, only the invisible pressure of sound. Some tried to dismiss it as imagination, but when nets trembled as though brushed by currents from above, when gulls scattered from empty skies, the whispers began. The York was still flying. Pilots, too, told uneasy tales. A British transport captain flying from Athens to Nicosia reported that his co-pilot had seen lights pacing them across the night, sea-white glimmers. Steady, at the altitude of another aircraft, They maintained formation for minutes before slipping away into nothingness. Radar confirmed no traffic. Controllers had nothing on their screens. Yet the co-pilot swore he had seen windows, a faint glow, as if from within a cabin. He described it as a plane trying to find its way home, but never quite arriving. His words, repeated in the mess halls of air bases, became part of the lore. The York was looking for its runway, forever circling, forever lost. Families of the vanished began reporting strange experiences that only deepened the sense of haunting. A mother in Portsmouth, who had lost her husband and son on the flight, claimed that she was awakened one night by the sound of knocking at her window. When she arose, she heard, faintly but unmistakably, her child's voice calling her name as if from far above. Another widow reported that she had received a phone call days after the disappearance, and though the line was filled with static, she swore she heard her husband's voice saying, "We are still in the air." When the operator checked, the call had no record of origin. In London, a clerk sorting through unclaimed mail recalled a package addressed to a man listed as lost on the York. The oddity was not the package itself, but the fact that it bore a postmark dated weeks after the disappearance. Inside was nothing unusual, only a scarf, but the handwriting on the label was confirmed by the man's family to be his. How could it have been sent? How could it have arrived from a man who had vanished into the sea? The incident was never explained, but the clerk kept the package as though afraid that discarding it might invite a curse. The supernatural weight of the story grew heavier as the years passed. By the late 1950s, Cyprus had developed its own folklore around the event. Shepherds in the hills spoke of hearing engines in the dead of night, and some claimed that their flocks would suddenly panic, scattering as if shadowed by something unseen overhead. Locals said that the York's crew had not died, but had entered a liminal state, trapped between worlds, their souls bound to a machine that could not find rest. They called it the Wandering Bird, a phantom aircraft that circled endlessly above the Mediterranean, unseen by most, but heard by those sensitive to the invisible dot in Malta. Old women crossed themselves when the subject was mentioned. Some believed the York had been taken by spirits of the sea, a punishment for disturbing sacred waters. Others whispered of a curse lingering from the war, when bombers had flown from the same airfields to rain destruction on cities. Perhaps the York, born from the body of a Lancaster, carried with it ghosts from that older conflict, ghosts who finally demanded payment. As the tale seeped into folklore, its supernatural manifestations became bolder. In 1961, a Royal Air Force pilot landing in Cyprus swore that he saw, on final approach, another aircraft descending alongside him. He described it clearly: 4 engines, broad wings, the silhouette unmistakably that of a York. He braced for collision, only to watch the phantom dissolve into mist just as the wheels kissed the runway. Shaken, he reported it to his superiors, who dismissed it as fatigue. But the control tower, when pressed, admitted they too had seen lights in the sky that matched no scheduled flight. There were other sightings, scattered across decades. A shipping vessel crossing from Crete to Alexandria reported a low-flying aircraft circling them 3 times before vanishing into cloudless sky. The crew described it as glowing, silent, and too close. In 1973, a private pilot near Rhodes radioed that he was being shadowed by what looked like an Avro York. His transmission cut off mid-sentence, though he landed safely minutes later, claiming the plane had vanished without trace. Each story added to the legend. Each story stretched the haunting further from its origin. By then, the York had ceased to be a memory of one flight. It had become an archetype of the ghost plane, a vessel trapped between Earth and eternity, its passengers doomed to endless transit. The supernatural weight of its disappearance was not only in the sightings, but in the atmosphere it left behind it. Sense that the Mediterranean sky itself had been scarred, and that every flight across it risked brushing against the edge of the unknown. And yet, the most chilling accounts did not come from the sea or the sky, but from the dreams of those still tethered to the missing. A young girl who had lost her father on the flight grew up haunted by recurring visions. In them, she saw rows of passengers sitting silently, their eyes open but blank, as if they were aware of nothing. She dreamed of the cockpit, where the crew sat rigid, hands frozen on controls, mouths moving but producing no sound. She would wake gasping, certain that what she had seen was not dream but transmission, a glimpse into their eternal state. She later described it as a plane where time has stopped, where no one knows they are gone. It was as if the York had not crashed, but crossed into another dimension where its engines still droned, its lights still glowed, but where no landing was possible. To those left in this world, it appeared only as fragment sounds, lights, visions seeping through cracks in reality. The haunting was not a single event, but a series of bleak reminders that the missing had not moved on. By the 1980s, the legend had grown so strong that paranormal investigators began to include the York among the great aviation mysteries of the world. They linked it to other disappearances, weaving a tapestry of haunted skies. They spoke of sky corridors, invisible passages where time and space bent, trapping aircraft in loops. They suggested that the York had flown into such a corridor, condemned to circle until the end of time, appearing now and then as a reminder of its fate. Skeptics dismissed these ideas, but believers pointed to the sheer persistence of reports. The way witnesses who had never heard of the York described the same shape, the same sound, and through it all, the Mediterranean remained silent, keeping its secret. No wreckage surfaced, no bodies were found. The sea that had swallowed ancient fleets and whispered myths of gods and monsters now held within it a modern ghost. The York had joined the pantheon of the lost, but unlike ships whose bones were eventually found, it remained untouched, untouchable. Its story a wound that never closed. As the legend darkened, so too did the atmosphere surrounding it. Some said that, speaking of the York invited misfortune, that to tell its story aloud was to draw the attention of its wandering spirits. Pilots who joked about it sometimes found their instruments glitching inexplicably. Fishermen who mocked the tale reported nightmares of drowning, of being dragged into skies filled with smoke. The ghost plane had become more than a memory, it had become an active force, a presence that punished those who dismissed it. And in this, the haunting reached its next stage. No longer confined to rumor, the York began to intrude upon lives directly. It was no longer just a story told in whispers. It was an atmosphere, a presence, an unseen companion in the skies of the Mediterranean. Something had broken in 1953, not just a flight, not just a line on a map, but the boundary between life and death, between past and present. The York had vanished, but it had not left. It had become a ghost that refused to fade, a shadow that grew darker with each retelling, until those who encountered it felt not just fear, but the creeping certainty that perhaps the dead are not as far from us as we believe. There is a moment in every haunting when whispers become voices, when shadows take shape, when what was once uncertain and peripheral steps fully into the world of the living. For the legend of the 1953 Avro York, that moment arrived not in a single thunderclap of revelation but in a series of mounting encounters, each one eroding the distance between the vanished and those who remained. What had been rumor and suggestion began to coalesce into manifestation, and in that coalescence the York ceased to be a ghost story and became a living ghost itself. The airmen who spoke of strange lights in the Mediterranean were once mocked for fatigue or imagination, but as accounts multiplied, laughter gave way to unease. Military archives in Cyprus and Malta, long sealed, later revealed a string of peculiar incidents. Controllers reported unidentified echoes appearing on radar in the dead of night, blips resembling the signature of a York aircraft, flying standard approach paths before dissolving mid-air. The reports were logged, quietly dismissed, but the men who watched those screens never forgot. One operator, years later, recalled how the ghostly blip would sometimes linger just long enough for him to imagine the descent, the wheels extending, the final approach, and then nothing. Like watching someone arrive at your door and vanish before knocking. He said. There were sightings more visceral still. A young officer stationed in Cyprus recounted a night when he was walking alone near the base airstrip. The wind was calm, the stars sharp, when suddenly he heard the unmistakable roar of piston engines. He looked up and saw, clear against the night, the silhouette of a Frenzied York descending low. He braced for the ground to shake with impact, but the plane passed silently overhead, its lights faint, its fuselage almost translucent, as though carved from mist. The officer fell to his knees, paralyzed by dread, and when he looked again, the sky was empty. He never returned to that airstrip after dark. These were not isolated events. Villagers on Cyprus began reporting strange aircraft circling at night, its engines moaning with a rhythm that rattled windows and stirred dogs into howling. One farmer claimed that his fields were lit briefly by the glow of cabin windows, a moving rectangle of pale light that crossed his land and disappeared into the hills. Children in Malta whispered of seeing shadows of passengers in the clouds, faces pressed against invisible windows, eyes wide and unblinking. Priests were called to bless the coasts, muttering prayers against restless spirits. Yet the stories grew darker with every attempt to suppress them. The haunting did not remain confined to sky and sea. It seeped into the homes of the bereaved. A widow in London awoke one night to find her bedroom filled with the smell of aviation fuel. On her desk lay her husband's watch, which had been lost with him on the York, ticking faintly as though it had never stopped. A mother in Liverpool claimed that her radio, long broken, suddenly crackled to life at midnight, transmitting the sound of engines and muffled voices speaking coordinates. She swore she heard her son's laughter within the static before the radio went dead again. Each incident deepened the sense that the York was not resting in silence but reaching back, struggling to anchor itself once more in the realm of the living. Paranormal researchers began to circle the legend, drawn by the growing weight of testimony. They spoke of liminal flights, aircraft caught between dimensions, their crews suspended in a twilight state. They suggested that the York had slipped through a tear in reality, a doorway hidden in the fabric of the Mediterranean sky, and that what people heard and saw were fragments bleeding through. To believers, this explained why the aircraft was seen in ghostly form, why the sounds of engines persisted in places where no machine flew. Skeptics dismissed it as hysteria, but the skeptics had no answer for why so many witnesses, across decades and continents, described the same vision, a York gliding silently, impossibly, with its windows glowing faintly as though lives were still inside. And then came the encounters that crossed from sight to contact. In 1979, a British Airways crew flying over the Ionian Sea reported a chilling incident. At cruising altitude, they received a distress call on an emergency frequency. The voice was faint, distorted, but it gave the call sign GAHF, eighth registration of the lost York. The crew froze, recognizing the impossible. The voice repeated coordinates, garbled and indistinct, before dissolving into static. When ground control checked, there was no traffic, no record of transmission, no explanation. The event was buried in reports, never publicly released, but among aviators it spread like wildfire. The lost York was still calling, still trying to be heard. By the 1980s, the York was spoken of with reverence and dread, a cautionary tale told in mess halls and bars. Pilots whispered of hearing its engines in their headsets, of seeing its shadow pacing them on moonlit flights. Fishermen who once laughed at the stories now crossed themselves when a low drone rose from empty skies. Even skeptics found themselves unsettled by the persistence of it all. If nothing else, they admitted, the York was a ghost in history itself, story too strange to forget, too silent to explain. But the climax of the haunting lay not in scattered reports, but in the collective weight of belief. For when enough people believe in a ghost, it begins to take on a life of its own, fed by fear, shaped by memory, sustained by longing. The York had become more than a vanished aircraft. It was now a vessel of grief, a receptacle for the unresolved sorrow of dozens of families, for the superstitions of sailors and pilots, for the myths of the Mediterranean. It was as if the vanished souls were gathering strength, drawing upon the energy of the living, manifesting with greater clarity. There are stories rare terrifying of those who claimed to board it. One sailor in Alexandria told of dreaming that he was walking across a deserted airstrip when he saw the York waiting, engines humming, door open. Drawn by a force he could not resist, he climbed aboard and found the cabin full of passengers sitting motionless, their eyes blank, their lips moving soundlessly. The air smelled of salt and smoke. A stewardess passed him in the aisle, her face pale, her uniform scorched at the edges. When he tried to speak, she turned her hollow eyes to him and whispered, "You are not on the manifest." He woke screaming, drenched in sweat, and refused ever to sail again. Others told of being visited in sleep by loved ones who had been lost on the York, speaking calmly as though nothing had happened, asking mundane questions about life at home. But behind their words was an unspoken truth. They did not know they were dead. They believed themselves still in flight, still waiting to land, still circling in endless twilight. It was not simply a haunting, it was a purgatory. By the turn of the century, the York's legend had grown into something almost sacred, an open wound in the sky. Modern pilots, flying advanced jets with GPS and satellite communication, still reported strange anomalies over the Mediterranean, instruments flickering, phantom blips on screens, disembodied voices breaking through frequencies. To most, these were dismissed as glitches, but to those who knew the story, they were the pulse of something older, something unresolved. The climax of this haunting lies not in the terror of a crash, but in the realization of endless transit, of a journey without end. To imagine the York is to imagine rows of passengers locked in timeless flight, their children grown old in the world below, their names carved into stone, while they sit suspended in air, unaware that decades have passed. The engines drone on, a lullaby of eternity, the captain's voice murmuring course corrections that lead nowhere. Outside the windows, stars drift by like indifferent witnesses, and below, the sea reflects no shadow. They are not gone, and yet they are not here. They are in between, trapped in the cruelest fate of all, to be forever in motion, never to arrive. This is the climax of the ghost plane's story, not horror in the form of blood or fire, but horror in the form of endlessness, a fate where the passengers' souls circle the Mediterranean skies forever, glimpsed by the living as flickers, echoes, visions. The York became a mirror of human fear, not of death itself, but of the possibility that death never comes, that instead we drift endlessly, unseen, unheard, waiting for a landing that never arrives. The silence that followed was not silence at all, but the dense layering of sounds that no human ear should ever grow accustomed to. It was the hush of wings not beating, the murmurs of voices not speaking, the groan of an aircraft not flying yet suspended in eternity. When Eleanor stepped back from the fractured altar of her visions, she realized she had not returned to any world she once knew. She stood at the threshold of two realities, one anchored in the soil of Britain, the other drifting endlessly in the upper atmosphere where the Skyways Avro York still traced its ghostly loop, forever halfway between departure and arrival. She felt the air grow cold around her ankles, as though the ground beneath her was no longer ground but the hull of something metallic, a fuselage trembling with both memory and desire. The others felt it to Harold, stoic though his lips quivered, Father Alistair, whispering prayers in Latin that sounded less like devotion and more like desperate negotiation, and young Thomas, staring wide-eyed into the middle distance as if he could see faces pressed against invisible windows in the air. And then it began again. The faint lowing of engines rolled across the landscape like thunder miles away, though no cloud stained the sky. The Avro York's ghost had returned to complete its endless circle. Its voice was not the growl of combustion but the echo of unfulfilled intent, like a dream that knows it should have woken but lingers too long in the mind. Eleanor raised her eyes and saw it first. The outline shimmered into existence against the horizon. Silver grey yet translucent, an aircraft formed not of riveted steel but of woven mist and memory. It banked gently as though descending toward them, and within the outline of its fuselage, shadows shifted human shapes, leaning, moving, waiting. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet none of them moved. It was not paralysis of the body but captivity of the soul, as though the plane's very presence locked them into place. They were participants in a ritual that had begun long before their birth, and would continue long after their bones returned to dust. The ground beneath them quivered. The meadow where they stood no longer smelled of grass but of kerosene, scorched oil, and the faint acrid trace of ozone. Time thinned. Eleanor felt herself stretched across decades, tethered simultaneously to the present moment and to that night in 1953 when passengers clutched their seats. The pilot called into the void of static-filled radios, and the York slipped from the map into the hidden corridors of the unseen. Then she heard them, the passengers, faint at first, but growing with each passing second, like voices carried through a tunnel carved into eternity. A woman sobbing quietly, murmuring a prayer in Italian, a child asking when they would land, a man grumbling about the lateness of the flight, each voice suspended, cut off mid-sentence, doomed to repeat the unfinished cadence forever. Eleanor clasped her hands together, her fingernails digging crescent moons into her palms. The realization was not new, but this time it carried the weight of finality. The York had never landed because it had never left. It had been claimed by a realm that traded flesh for echoes, wings for shadows, life for lingering. Father Alistair, voice trembling, stepped forward. He raised a crucifix, but it glowed no brighter than a common trinket under the heavy pall of spectral machinery. The engine's drone rose louder, shaking the very marrow of their bones. He called for the lost to find peace, for the sky to release what it had trapped. but the words fell apart before they reached the air. It was not resistance, but disinterest. The ghost plane had no quarrel with prayers. It was itself a prayer unanswered, a plea never heard. Harold, his war-hardened face pale, turned to Eleanor with the eyes of a man who had seen too much. "It's not them we fear," he muttered hoarsely. "It's what keeps them. Something holds that plane like a moth pinned to glass." The plane descended lower, its undercarriage almost grazing the earth, though no grass bent beneath its weight. The shapes inside became clearer, pale faces pressed against unseen glass, lips moving in words that could not breach the boundary. Then one face met Eleanor's gaze, a woman, late 30s perhaps, hair pinned back neatly as though still prepared for disembarkation, eyes wide with a recognition that chilled Eleanor to her marrow. The woman's lips formed words without sound, yet Eleanor understood them as clearly as if they were whispered in her ear. "Stay with us." The invitation was not hostile, it was tender, almost desperate, but tenderness in eternity was terror itself. Thomas screamed suddenly, pointing at the sky. Above the York, a second outline shimmered into being, then a third, then a fourth. Entire squadrons of forgotten flights materialized, each one tracing a ghostly arc, all suspended in a net of skies unseen. These were not just planes of 1953, but relics from decades past, bombers that never returned from missions, civilian flights that vanished without explanation, test crafts that disappeared into silence. Each carried shadows, faces, gestures of longing, a spectral fleet stretching as far as the eye could see, each bound to the same eternal holding pattern. Eleanor's heart pounded with the horror of comprehension. The skies were not empty, they were archives. The heavens above them were an infinite hangar, storing every lost flight, every unanswered call, and now the fleet had noticed them. The air grew thin, as though the atmosphere itself demanded payment. Their lungs burned, their skin prickled with frost, and shadows lengthened unnaturally behind them. Eleanor felt her body tug toward the shimmering fuselage of the York, as if invisible hands sought to pull her aboard. She clung to the earth, but the ground beneath her shifted like the tilting deck of a ship at sea. Father Alistair shouted prayers louder, his voice cracking. Harold gripped Thomas, holding him tightly, though his own feet slid forward against his will. The spectral woman inside the York extended her hand, palm pressed against invisible glass, her eyes pleading. Eleanor whispered a single word, "No," yet her voice carried no conviction. The temptation was overwhelming to step into the fuselage and end the gnawing uncertainty, to belong to something eternal, to never be left behind again. The engines roared, louder now, shaking the heavens and rattling bones. The York seemed ready to merge with their world fully, to cross the fragile barrier between ghost and flesh. Eleanor's vision darkened at the edges, her body vibrating with the resonance of unearthly machinery. She closed her eyes, and for a moment she was there inside the fuselage, seated among the passengers. She smelled the perfume of the Italian woman, heard the shuffle of feet on the aisle, felt the vibration of engines through the seat. They all turned to her, their faces pale yet kind, asking silently if she would stay. And then she opened her eyes, back in the meadow, breathless, heart hammering. The York had risen slightly, retreating into the higher clouds. The spectral fleet dissolved like mist under sunlight, vanishing one by one until the sky was empty once more. The silence that followed was suffocating. No bird called, no wind stirred, just the echo of an absence so vast it felt louder than any sound. They stood trembling, uncertain if they had survived an encounter or had merely been spared a postponement. Harold spoke first, his voice hoarse. "They'll return, not just this night, always." Eleanor nodded slowly. She knew he was right. The ghost plane was not gone. It never would be. It would circle eternally, a wound in the sky that never healed. And sometimes, on rare nights, when the air thinned and the veil weakened, it would descend again, seeking passengers, seeking witnesses, seeking to remind the living that the skies were not ours alone. Father Alistair dropped his crucifix into the grass, his faith fractured, his hands trembling. Thomas clung to Eleanor, his eyes wide, asking silently the question no adult dared voice. "Will they come for us?" Eleanor had no answer, only the certainty that someday, perhaps when she was old, perhaps tomorrow, she would hear the drone of engines again, and she would know the York had returned for her. The night grew darker though no sun had set, shadows thickening unnaturally. Eleanor glanced upward one last time. For the briefest instant, she thought she saw the faint glimmer of windows high above. Faces pressed once more against the glass, and then all was empty. But emptiness itself had teeth. She turned to the others, and together they walked away from the meadow, though none would ever speak of the path their feet took. Behind them, the air shimmered faintly, as though a great door had closed but not locked, and as they disappeared into the night, a sound rose again so faint it could be mistaken for imagination. The distant, rhythmic hum of engines still turning, still waiting, still circling. The sky was not silent. It never had been, and somewhere above, unseen yet eternal, the ghost plane of 1953 prepared once more to descend.